Good morning once again, and thank you to an amazing panel. So I think, guys, this is going to be very exciting. We've got a lot of change happening in Africa and in South Africa specifically. And earlier we were talking about, I was presenting on AI. We were talking about infrastructure and infrastructure investments. And we're going to get straight into the panel and with my esteemed guests. So I think we're seeing operators having issues, I guess, around their capital expenditure and how they're investing. I remember one of the CEOs of the operators told me once, many years ago, if you take the world and you turn it over, the world will be stood up by base stations. And I think, Enzo, that leads me to my first question. It's around, I guess, capital intensity and investments. And I guess the problems we're seeing is that prices are going down, but you guys have to invest. So maybe share from an MTN perspective, your thoughts around how are you guys doing it?
So firstly, thanks, Nitesh. So, the previous speaker spoke about kind of the cost of data being too high. I think if you speak to any telco practitioner, they'd say that the cost of data is too low, right? So the data point I give you, Nitesh, to start with, and I talk for MTN, but there's similar numbers. There's a Tech Central article on this, is capital investment in South Africa over time. I can speak from an African perspective, but MTN today invests 30 billion rand a year in network capex. And on top of that, we have IT capex, right?
Wow.
We return, and almost all of that is on data networks. We return today 15 to 17 billion in growth on the data revenue line,
wow,
right? And so when you look at kind of free cash flow over time, we may be growing service revenue in double digits, but free cash flow in dollar terms, you either low single digits or negative over the last 5 years. So I was just showing Simo when we were sitting there, is that if you look at telco shares over the last 5 years, they're all in decline because of that phenomena, right? And that's because I think as an industry, we didn't understand really kind of the cost of production. We were fiercely competitive and we gave data away at rates that are below that cost of production, right? I think we're becoming a bit smarter now. We're not that intelligent yet, but we are understanding the cost of production. And once we start looking at, and if you think about growth, guys, if you think about growth, we're all in high inflation markets in Africa. Growth is CPI plus 8 to 10%, right? So you've got to get that up. The problem in Africa is that data yields are coming down, right? And let me just give you some stats, is how the telco networks, and this is collectively, have served the African continent in infrastructure, but actually haven't benefited really from that, right? Is in 2018, we started our Chase program. The average user across Africa was using 2.1 gigs. Today, it's 10.2 gigs, 5 times.
Sure.
The average cost per gigabyte was $1.40. The average cost per gigabyte today is 40 cents. And the share prices of all of these networks have gone from roughly, let's say, 100% to about 66% today. So everybody else has benefited from the infrastructure, but Africa hasn't, right? So, and I'll give you another data point just on 5G. There's a lot of investment happening in 5G. I sat on a panel at MWC, similar to this panel, facilitated by Huawei, and no operator in the world is making money on 5G. High levels of investment, the handset costs are too high. None of our consumers can buy a 5G handset, and we have empty networks where we're only doing FWA. And most of the FWA, so FWA on LTE, congests networks and ultimately are margin dilutive. They're not sustainable. So I know it kind of paints a gloomy picture, but I think the economics of data need to start making sense again, and that requires regulation. It requires people like OTTs to start paying their way, and it requires operators to become a bit smarter and pushing back on this demand for free data left, right, and center.
No, that's fantastic. So maybe, Simo, let's bring you into this, right? From a Telkom perspective, same thoughts?
As I was contemplating coming into this panel, one thing I didn't worry preparing about having worked with Enzo before was the numbers, and you will have all of them. In this
They've all worked together, ladies and gentlemen.
So I think the one very interesting part is, to compound the problem, call it for economies of scale matter. If a bigger, call it multinational operator like an MTN is feeling the impact of this high capex intensity environment, you can imagine when you now scale that down to a smaller operator like Telkom, where we still need to compete and remain relevant in terms of providing quality of service to our customers at the same level, because consumers don't care about everything that we've said, except that they want best quality data at the best price available. So
right.
In that sense, you then get the compounding of the issues for I'll call it the smaller networks. But I think to try and solve or to find the right balance, we have coined a term which is not necessarily, I think we own it, but of smart capex. We really have embarked on a very disciplined smart capex investment strategy within Telkom. What I mean by that is we have a good balance. I think earlier on there was a discussion around partnerships. I think when you really look at how partnerships have come to the fore and how we manage this within a Telkom perspective, is that we, carry about 90% plus of our traffic on our own network, because it makes a little commercial sense or financial sense to do so. But the less than 10% of the traffic that could almost exponentially double the cost
wow.
of investment, we then carry that through the partnerships that we have with both Vodacom and MTN in terms of roaming agreements. So that makes it, makes the business, make it a bit more viable for us to be able to balance our own investment vis-a-vis, the partnerships. And if you compound that to probably what we may consider a nice problem to have, is that we are the fastest growing mobile network in the country currently, and which means we're currently having significant traffic growth.
Yes.
So the balance between coverage and capacity is another one that we need to balance with, because we're loading our network quite fast, and my CTO is like, hey, your traffic is double-digit growing, but your revenue is not, following suit, right?
You're doing your job too well.
So the balance now is about saying, how do you invest, split that capex investment between investing in capacity vis-a-vis investing for coverage. So that is another balance, I think, that that we have, as a networks. Yeah.
Great, thank you. Mohale, maybe let's bring in some thoughts on Vodacom. Very exciting, interesting discussion.
Yeah, it's interesting. I don't know who's making who older, but I finally get a chance to settle this score with Enzo. For close on 3 decades now, you saw that sense of precision about numbers. I've suffered through being kicked on a football pitch, to having Enzo as a client, squeezing my margins when I used to own an ad agency. It's finally nice to be on the same side of the numbers, where we want the same thing. And it's all been said, and that tension between the growing traffic, which is essential for everything that we need to remain connected to our lives and our worlds. And on the other hand, the ultimate question of who pays for that? Because, as has been spoken to, the return aspect of the equation is coming undone. Voice is a complete disaster all around. structure is moving against you becomes problematic. And for customers, it's fine at point in time if you're experiencing reducing cost. But you have to ask yourself the question ultimately, not just at a jurisdictional level, but continentally, as I was saying earlier, if the telcos are no longer a viable investment proposition, what does it mean for the continent?
Yes.
Yes, fine, you can say so-and-so will aim their satellites. What happens when they re-aim them? Does the continent go back into a period of darkness and disconnectedness, or do we have to take a view to say that we have to keep Africa connected and connected at the cutting edge and absolutely deal with the issues of how we share more, how we cooperate more, and absolutely compete for the affections and support of customers. But from a backbone and infrastructure perspective, we have to start thinking differently, because even the CAPEX is not exactly helping us either. So there's a genuine issue in terms of CAPEX intensity, which speaks to renewal and sustainability of our networks to deliver services. But on the other end, there's much more that still needs to happen in order for those services to be delivered. Enzo again has spoken to, it's not just inflation, it's that these networks are by and large built in dollars. Our currencies all around are taking a hammering, and that's something that needs attention to say that what do we need to do then on the production end of the equation to start to look to localize some of that production, and what, if anything, should we be doing from an innovation perspective? That's not an enterprise level issue. It's not even a country level issue. It's a continent level issue, which warrants much more extensive discussion than we're able to have, and it certainly can't be left to us alone as the network operators. The societies of which we are part have to come together. The AU, I think, in particular, has an important role to play, and to prod and provoke the policymakers at jurisdiction level to start to build the frameworks that will keep Africa not only connected, but to ensure that that connectivity grows, because there's still substantial parts of the continent which we haven't connected. And if we're going to bring peace into those areas, one of the most powerful enablers is communication infrastructure. Security, problematic. To add insult to already grave injury, the power situation that we're faced with now. So power availability becomes a problem. In Lesotho, we import Eskom's challenges. Thankfully, it's been improving, but we've now got the shutdown of the Mohale hydropower station, which in our instance takes out between 41 to 49% of our available power, depending on, and it also breaks the tariff altogether, because the tariff differential is quite huge. So you then go the route of, okay, we're going to clean up our energy footprint. You can't run networks on solar energy alone. It's not sustainable. What happens when the sun doesn't come out? As happens often to us in the Lesotho mountains.
So it's big mountains.
You have only so many hours of storage. The storage modules are bloody expensive, because again, those inputs are also in dollars. And it goes back to the return equation, which comes undone. So we really have to attend to the totality of inputs that we need in order to sustain and improve the services that we deliver. But as societies, we have to ask ourselves the difficult questions on what are the new models that are necessary. Thank you.
Thanks. I loved what you're saying there, and I want to bring Lavina into this. You spoke about keeping Africa connected. You'll have to, right? If you think about, COVID was a few years ago. You guys kept Africa alight. Let's not forget that, right? We are speaking about the role of the AU, Lavina, and Mohale, eloquently put it out that, they need to help the telcos. From an African Union perspective, how would you advise them to support the telcos through some of these challenges they're facing?
Okay, so that's quite an interesting question. So there's a lot of initiatives on the go at the moment from an AU perspective, in support of telcos. Obviously, we understand that, this particular industry is pretty much the cornerstone in terms of, enabling all of us. And having said that, there are initiatives that are on the go, like, for example, the Agenda 2063, which is set out by the African Union, which really talks to three major pillars. Those major pillars are inclusivity, growth, and sustainability. And within each of those, it really boils down into, us as a digital citizen, as well as, supportive of the landscape. So when we have to talk about addressing those issues across the continent, one is obviously regulation. Regulation kind of is very disparate across the continent. In terms of what South Africa has versus what Algeria has is completely different. So harmonizing and getting that standard up is something that the AU is actively working on. In terms of, for example, competition also varies across the continent. So you have some areas that are highly dense in competition areas and others where there's 0 to none that exist. So again, it's balancing out the landscape across the continent to make sure that those areas are actually being filled. And I think Mohale highlighted that in his talk earlier on, in terms of the gaps that are existing, those digital gaps. Another area for us is in terms of maintenance of the networks that are there, that are actually in operation. That also plays quite a large role in terms of keeping the sustainability portion up and running. There's another area in terms of the speed of adoption versus the actual speed of innovation. So those are two very distinctive areas, and within the telco industry, we've seen the speed of innovation really take off to the point where we've seen an MVNO kind of spin up, within minutes, done all by AI through voice. All the way from your campaigns to pricing to everything, that traditionally takes up to about 18 months in a normal circumstance. So, technology itself allows for a lot of the embedded solutions to kind of come in play. So, to kind of wrap all of that, I guess there's multiple initiatives from the AU perspective, but there's infrastructure, there's the maintenance, there's the technology, there's the accessibility that is required. So, all in all, I think that's the main driver from an AU perspective.
Fantastic. So Enzo, I want to come back to you. And you highlighted a lot of interesting facts and data points. But, you said earlier that no one's really making money out of 5G, right? And smartphone adoption is key to that. But it's expensive. It's expensive to get these smartphones out there. And I actually have two questions. One is, how are you guys working with the OEMs to try and get them to understand it's important to lower the price point on the device side? Second one, we spoke about OTTs. And do you see it like they're getting a free ride on your networks? And are the playing fields the same with the OTTs and the benefits they get from what telcos have?
So firstly, a good questions. I'll start with handsets, right?
Yeah.
And I'll pull the lens back a bit. So MTN's framework for growing data across the continent is what we call CHASE. You've got to think about this holistically. So the first is coverage. So what's the coverage? So today we have 80% population coverage on 4G, right? The second is handsets. The problem is only 40% of our customers have handsets. So you've invested the capex, but you've got a 2-to-1 deficiency on coverage versus handset ownership. And you're not going to unlock that investment unless you solve the handset problem. The third one is affordability. I spoke to that earlier, where the prices are coming down, I think, at about 20% compounded, and we need to start flattening that out. The fourth is service bundling, and the fifth is education. We've done quite a bit of work on this, and we look at each of those pillars. The big blockage for us since COVID has been handset pricing. So as an example, handset pricing on a entry-level 4G has gone from $30 to $40 today to $50, right? Because the chip owners, when there was a scarcity of silicon, they used those chips in more expensive devices. So you have an underserving of the cheap devices. So all of a sudden, for the people who most need it, you have those prices going up. So what are we doing? So what are we doing is two things. So the first is we're working with some OEMs to say, how do we take this device? We do a bill of materials. We break down the device completely into its component parts, and saying, what do we need to have a functioning 4G device so that somebody in Africa can access the internet meaningfully? And what we try to do is take out stuff we don't think as that important, right? And so we're getting those prices down to probably 25, 30% lower than it's been. Still not low enough, right? So that's the first thing. The second thing is we're working with some Chinese chip manufacturers on doing what we call a cloud phone. So you take all the functionality out of a smartphone and you put it in the cloud. So essentially this is just an internet phone. So whatever it needs, it goes to the internet for. So it's got to be always on. And that's actually coming in at about $16 to $18. We're running a trial in South Africa with it, and so are Geo doing it in India. And for me, that's quite exciting, but I think the form factor is a bit clunky, right? But then I think there are other things you've got to think about, because if devices is the problem, how do we solve that? We work with a Kenyan company, because in most of Africa, the market's is not a MNO-led market like ours. So we work with a Kenyan company called Mkopa, and Mkopa give unsecured loans to people who want devices. So they tell you a Samsung Galaxy, you put 25% of the cost down, you give an ID, that's all you give, and you give them a Momo, mobile money, or M-Pesa account number, and what they do is they debit you daily then for that, and we would bundle the data. So every day you get you get to use the device, and then you've got to pay your dollar. If you don't pay your dollar, that device is progressively shut off, right? But so Mkopa do 120,000 of these loan devices in Kenya. They're doing a significant amount with us in Uganda, and now in Ghana. We hope to launch in Nigeria and elsewhere. But for me, that's probably one of the most exciting things. I'll build on that a bit with the OTTs. So we're doing a similar model in Rwanda. What Facebook have come to the party with, because we've asked all of the OTTs, guys, you benefiting from these devices in the market, we subsidizing them, and we subsidizing the data. Come to the party. Some of them have told us to get lost, but actually Meta came to the party, and in Rwanda said, here's $1 million. We will underwrite the bad debt so you can take more risk and get to lower end consumers. And that's worked pretty well for us. So Rwanda's lowest smartphone penetration, so it's 60% across Africa, smartphone penetration. Rwanda's at 29%, Uganda's at 39%. So these are fairly low, and that's because of historical tax on social media, et cetera, et cetera. So, I mean, maybe the point I want to make is handsets are the biggest obstacle to internet adoption in the continent, and I think if we're all going to focus somewhere, it's got to be we've all got to play a part to ensure that we can get meaningful devices into the hands of people through mechanisms like hardware, working capital management, and then financing.
Amazing. Thank you very much.
And of course, once we have the devices in market, they have to stay in. So the refurbishment programs, because we also can't have a continent that's full of devices that are being thrown away where we don't have disposal protocols, we don't have mechanisms for keeping them in people's hands rather than in unregulated dumps. And to be blunt, the OTT players are not doing their part. They don't build a single network. The entirety of their propositions rely on that. So again, we have important choices to make here. And this isn't about limiting freedom and connectivity.
They don't pay taxes as well.
Yeah, and it's got to be a simple thing. If you're not paying taxes, you're not building infrastructure, you damn well shouldn't be able to operate in the environments where the rest of us have to provide the infrastructure, pay taxes, pay people, and you name it, rather than running through creative tax avoidance shelters.
No, absolutely. Simo, thoughts?
No, I think we all kind of like in terms of the solutions we're trying to come up with, especially with regards to lowering the cost of devices, getting entry-level 4G devices is probably it's become one of those. It's a race to who launches first, kind of, and it's kind of sounds like for something that has to be almost like at the bottom end of the market. You would have thought, the network operators are chasing to have the latest, top-end devices. But all of us, I mean, the program is similar to what Enzo was talking about. It's something that both ourselves and I know Vodacom is also working on something similar because we're trying to all address, that particular challenge. And I think when it comes to also financing these devices, fortunately, the local retailers have also come to the party. When you look at the likes of Pepco Group. They've come up with very solid financing schemes for these devices. I mean, some of the stats I had from them recently is that on average, a customer would have been prepared to pay 1,000 Rand in cash for a smart device, is now prepared to take a 2,000 to 2,500 Rand device on a program that is financed over 4 months. And they've seen that they're now getting much more better, bigger screen size devices, which means customers are getting a better user experience and a lower access, accessibility to the network, and better usage experience. But the one point I just wanted to touch on with regards to access as well is, I think there's been a lot of touch on fixed wireless access discussion. I think to a certain extent we've seen that within our network that it has become one of call it a liberator of access to to high speed data for call it within a family environment or within shared, especially the youth. The youth tend to club together in groups to actually get better access to a much more quality network speed and much more affordable data using fixed wireless access in the form of other prepaid services in that sense, and that is driving bigger consumption. And if we're able to provide devices at the right price and at the right level, that will make sure that we are able to then cater for customers who then gets better usage. Hopefully we then be in a position to extract better return on investment on the capex that we invest on our networks.
Mohale, I want to actually get you to comment on something that Simo mentioned. He spoke about the right financing, but getting the right partners like Pepco Group, etc., who also understand the market as deeply as you guys do. And Vodacom, I'm sure, is working with these type of partners. What's your thought is getting that ecosystem working, right? Because it's you guys plus your partners getting these devices out there. Everyone needs to, be part of solving this problem.
Absolutely. And the key thing here for us to make improvements there, because we've gone from a scenario where we used to just subsidize the devices. Out of interest, our smartphone penetration in Lesotho sits at about between 74 and 76%. And that's been achieved by and large by the importation of devices which are well spec'd for what customers actually need as a minimum viable product, and us subsidizing that to make sure that we are able to deliver the experience we want to deliver to the customer. And we've now gone into an acceleration mode with finance devices working with different partners, because again, the default setting in terms of the lenders in market, the risk appetite wasn't there. So to the point of who's going to take the first hit and the underwriting that's necessary to make the pricing workable is absolutely fundamental. So you need that at a systemic level to say access to credit is a fundamental thing all around. Access to connectivity, as we've already all acknowledged, is bordering on being a human right. So what are the things that we need to do together in order to facilitate that? But we are still in need of more financing partners. We run an open environment where lenders can come in, where you, with regularity, invite the banks to come in, but they're quite hesitant because banks aren't used to managing credit on a day, week, and month-to-month basis. They tend to take longer horizons. Interestingly, though, the loss ratios are significantly lower than what you find in lending books that banks run. But even with that, the hesitation is still there. In the sense that we have the ability to lock these devices. Locking them is one thing, of course, but getting them back is quite another. But the point is you have much more control than you have, you finance somebody for a car. Good luck finding them. I used to work for a bank, and it was one of the more interesting things to do when things had come off the rails. But in our environment, it's a much more of a need, and therefore the propensity to honor the debts is a lot higher than a default lending environment. But it's one thing to have that as a fact. It's quite another to get a lender to come on board, because we're already doing facilitation to subsidize the phones. You can only go but so far from the standpoint of taking further, because all of that goes back to the margin issue.
Correct.
And what would also be helpful is that if our central bankers continentally would understand and have a more sophisticated monetary policy than interest rates. Even when you have situations where inflation is growing by the imported content in what we produce and not by demand, what do? Interest rates, interest rates, interest rates. It doesn't help us at all because it makes the same debt more expensive. A device which you could have given to a customer with more functionality, the value is now being eaten up by the cost of the debt because we're artificially increasing interest rates to the benefit of the bankers. Well done to them, but not to the benefit of the societies and communities we're meant to be serving.
So, Lavina, I'm going to bring you in here now. Mohale mentioned something very interesting just now. And if you look at one of the big problems the operators are facing, they're buying in dollars, not in local currency. You're finding a lot of controls around and fiscal policies and currency issues. Unfortunately, it's a fact, it's a problem in Africa, right? It's going down. And he mentioned something around when we're talking about handset devices. Should we be looking at manufacturing these things in this continent? Network equipment, devices. And it's a big question, but we are importing a lot of that. That's a fact. I mean, if you look at the currency devaluation in the likes of Nigeria, in months it's gone by hundreds of percentiles in months, which could deeply impact an entire operation. What do you think the African Union could do? We need skills, we need all of these things, right? But what do you think they could help facilitate and help these guys, even commercially, how they're procuring from the multiple vendors that are in the US or China, Korea, etc.?
So I think that's a multifaceted question, and I'll probably approach it from 2 or 3 different angles. One is you have obviously the leverage of BRICS at our favor at the moment. So that's an angle that the AU is, working close towards in terms of unpacking the full potential. Because we know from an infrastructure perspective, there is a lot of existing infrastructure within the continent that does not really belong to Africa. So, our close relation with BRICS would help to turn that around to some degree. So those are conversations that's happening on ground. When you talk about, buying at an international price versus, manufacturing locally, there's lots of studies on the AU front that we're busy doing at the moment. One of them, which I can share, is around chip manufacturing. So, for example, we're looking at the raw materials that we're literally, producing and harvesting within our continent, and how can we keep that into a first layer prefabrication before we send it out to the chip manufacturers themselves. So that is something that we're busy sort of mapping out at the moment. And we can already tell that there are quite a large few players in that area, and that in itself will add a lot of economic value to us as a country, right? As well as to the end consumer. So similarly with that, when we talk about manufacturing of cell phones, that is equally something that we could look at doing, in terms of mapping out what are the requirements, what is the sort of skill sets needed to support that, and how best can we address a policy or put in a policy in place to then, enhance or kind of unlock that particular ecosystem. When you have to talk about, AU from a global scale, we obviously have very large sort of reach with the likes of the UN, with, ITU, and, a few other players. And with that, we're also looking at how do we best leverage, a global stance. So as much as, yes, there are sort of issues that we need to figure out here, but we also need to, at the same breath, keep a foot in on the global sort of front. And, balancing that is something that we kind of need to look at. So, I guess at the end of the day, digital infrastructure is really something that helps us, or not helps us, but I guess is a compass. And it's a compass in terms of our progress, right? And so, for example, the accessibility of all of this, whether it be a billionaire that's flying his private jet that requires, Wi-Fi connectivity, or whether it is, a single mom that's running a farm that requires, aid, or whether it is, someone that is an elderly that's in a farm area that requires access to some form of healthcare. Everything is done via a device. So there's no way that we cannot look at how can we unify the sector, how can we unify the ecosystem, and how can we actually unlock it and sustain it. And I think that's the most important bit for us.
Fantastic. So Enzo, we're getting to the end. Final thoughts, sir.
Yeah.
And what help you want, regulatory, etc. Give it to us.
Well, we need a lot of help. So I think you've got to balance, just in very short, you've got to, regulators have to understand that you have to balance, for the sustainability of the industry, you've got to balance three things. The one is you need data to be cheap enough to drive economic growth, right, for penetration. The second is you need to serve shareholders, because shareholders have 1,000 places to invest their money. They're not going to invest it in Africa if they're not going to make a return.
100%.
Right? So that's the second one. And the third one is the telecoms ecosystem creates a massive amount of jobs, directly and indirectly. And if you don't preserve the industry, you're putting all of that at risk. So I think that regulators need to understand that they can't only serve a political need. They've got to serve the industry need, and they've got to serve the nation-state need.
Brilliant. Thank you. Simo.
I think to add on to all the cost of associated with building the networks, one of the biggest costs we didn't even talk about has been the cost of acquiring the spectrum.
Yes.
And that also adds on to our capex investment. And again, in that context of looking to regulators and government, is that where there are certain things maybe that we cannot control, such as rand dollar exchange or local currency to foreign currency, and some of OTTs and so forth that we can, when you look at that consideration, when we need, because we're always going to need access to more spectrum to be able to, to carry the traffic that the consumers demand in order to be able to, consume our services. So access to spectrum is key, but also access to spectrum at affordable prices will also be a big contributor towards making what is already a huge capex burden on the various networks operators a much more affordable or palatable investment to make going forward.
Amazing points. Mohale?
Thank you. Skills. We can have the spectrum, we can import and even, but to make the next step, which is to start to be developers of these technologies, we have to have the skills.
Yes.
We need reinvestment in the industrialization of those parts of the continent where there's potential and capacity for them to contribute towards a continental agenda. And we have to start thinking beyond country-level issues, whether it's to do with regulation or investment into more productive rather than consumptive economies. So there's no getting back to this idea of Africa for Africans, and it has to take root more and more, because you can't solve a lot of the challenges that we have at a country level. We need financing mechanisms that deal with continental dynamics, so we need the best thing that we've got by way of the AU and all the other regional bodies to start to play a more active part in there. And I haven't felt the impact of a BRICS bank, for example, and perhaps I'm not looking closely enough, but I don't know whether that agenda is closely enough aligned at a BRICS level to what the continent needs in order to grow, and us as players within this particular sector, which facilitates for other sectors. I think there's a lot of work that needs to be done there, because at the rate things are going, for those people who growing up, being developers, being cloud native, Africa won't be the place for them to be, because that nativity is going to take root somewhere else other than here. So we have to make sure that we remain relevant while we're developing the necessary skills, and that our governments have to play a more, and I was happy listening to the DDG, but we need more and more default thinking around digitalization and what the role of the sector is in that. We, as a sector, have played that role most actively, whether it's through basic devices that we've put into customers' hands, where they were never going to see a computer, they were never going to see a laptop. Some of them might not even see a tablet, but as it stands now, those people have the ability to be connected to a wider set of experiences. And we also have to deal with these content issues. We can't continue to be a continent that consumes so much content from outside, but which doesn't propagate. The Nollywoods and other places like that, great, but we have to think more specifically about content generation. Otherwise, we're just going to continuously connect ourselves to the globe and alienate ourselves more and more to the point where we won't recognize ourselves.
Very well articulated. Finally, Lavina.
So I would say, there's some stuff that we still need to get right, obviously. And, traveling in Africa, you kind of really feel the wrath of not having ease of use of your mobile device. So, that's something that I would urge, all the telco players to really take a look at in terms of making our lives easier when we're traveling out. But in addition to that, and in support of everyone here, I think it's definitely around things like investment, talent, and I think a little bit more in research and development. So, understanding where exactly our strengths lie, where exactly are our assets, because at the moment we don't have quite a clear picture from a continental perspective, that is. And I think also, policies, I'll touch on that a little bit. As much as we have, data policies, and we kind of went pre-COVID with 6 countries that had some form of a data privacy policy to now 37 countries post-COVID, having a data privacy. So that's really quick from a regulatory standpoint to see the adoption rate. But there's a lot more that we need to start doing. So we need to have more conversations around data sovereignty, data governance. We need to go deeper in terms of the emerging technologies that are coming about, because whether we like it or not, it's already in play on the continent. So how do we then, get together and circumvent those areas?
Wow. Guys, I think they need a standing ovation. That was an amazing panel. Maybe, come on. That was an amazing panel, guys. Amazing. Thank you so much to my esteemed panel members. That was great.
Indeed, Nitesh, it was an insightful panel discussion. Please, everyone, once again, give it a big round of applause.